In the comments of my previous video on bringing passenger services back to Cessnock, a few people said I should talk about the Toronto line, and there's a very good reason as to why. When it closed in 1990, it was incredibly controversial. For the most part, it was fairly well served, with trains every 20 minutes. But the government chose to close it due to low passenger numbers, and locals have been demanding its return ever since. So in this video, I'm going to discuss the history of the line, the current state of the infrastructure, what would be needed to resume passenger operations, and whether or not it would be viable in the first place. The best place to start this discussion would be with the line's layout. As built, the line branched off 20 metres north of Fassifern, where it then entered a curved platform. At Fassifern, there was also a loop track that avoided the platform altogether, but this was converted to a storage track for trains coming from Toronto sometime between 1962 and 1988. From there, the line continues east across Fassifern Road. The original bridge was a wooden beam bridge, but this was replaced sometime in the early 20th century with a concrete arch that remains today. The line then continues on towards Fennells Bay, where it follows the coastline. The line crosses a small steel beam bridge at Coffee Pot Creek, which appears to have been built with duplication in mind, but this was never undertaken. The line then continues south, where it reaches a single platform station of Blackalls, later renamed Blackalls Park in 1956. From there, it crosses Fawcett Street at a level crossing, before continuing south along Railway Parade, where it then crosses Mud Creek on a small beam bridge, followed by another level crossing across Lake Street, and then another larger beam bridge across Stony Creek. It then continues east, where it crosses Carey Street at a level crossing, before terminating alongside Lake Macquarie at Toronto Station. Additionally, there was a small stabling yard on the northern side of Toronto Station, but it closed sometime in the 1970s. There were also two additional set-down points between Blackalls Park and Toronto, being called Fennells and Bowers respectively, but these closed in 1910. The Toronto line was originally built as a tramway by the Excelsior Land Investment and Building and Bank Company, which was a prominent land development firm in New South Wales at the time. Of course, with the line being in Newcastle, the construction needed to work around collieries, with Excelsior having to negotiate consent from the Northumberland Coal Mining Company to put a tramway through their leasehold. Eventually, these issues were negotiated around, and Excelsior received consent, with the line opening on the 7th of March 1891. Prior to construction, there was actually some debate on what gauge the line should be. Originally, the line was to be 3-foot gauge, due to it being cheaper to construct, and the line being a lightly constructed tramway with tight curves. But it was decided to change to 4-foot 8.5-inch gauge in order to be interoperable with the New South Wales Government Railway network. As a tramway, the services were originally provided by horse-drawn carriages, which would shuttle people between Toronto and Fassifern. These horse-drawn carriages were complemented by two privately owned locomotives. The first being named Pygmy, which was originally built as number 29 for the New South Wales Government Railways back in 1864. In 1891, Pygmy was bought by the Excelsior Company for service on the Toronto line, a role that it performed until being sold to the Public Works Department in 1901, where it worked on various projects until being scrapped in 1923 by Gunnanen. The other locomotive was affectionately known as Coffee Pot. Coffee Pot was a small 040 vertical boiler locomotive, which is where its name came from. It was originally built for the government railways as number 1001 and worked Sandgate Cemetery trains. In 1893, Coffee Pot was hired by the Excelsior Company for Toronto services, where it worked until 1909, before being sold to Messrs Howley and Fernshaw for use of their Glenrock Colliery, where it served until 1925, before being stored and eventually scrapped in 1949. It seems that the people of Toronto grew to like Coffee Pot, as there are quite a few period photographs of it, and there's even a Coffee Pot Creek in Blackalls Park, which I assume is named after it. The passenger services provided by Pygmy and Coffee Pot were also complemented by government-run services, which ran from Newcastle down to Toronto on Sundays and public holidays. These services began in October 1891 and proved popular with recreation and picnic travellers. Frankly, with how beautiful Lake Macquarie can be, I'm not surprised it was a popular service. In March 1899, the line was leased to the Toronto Hotel and Tramway Company for a period of 10 years. during which time they ran it into the ground. They didn't have enough money to maintain the line, so track quality and train services began to deteriorate fast. By 1908, government-run services were withdrawn altogether due to safety concerns, and by March 1909, all traffic on the tramway had ceased. The first closure of the line was incredibly controversial at the time, with local residents petitioning the government to take over the line and resume services, which the government then did. In 1910, the government took over and temporarily ran tram motors from Sydney. Between 1910 and 1911, the government upgraded the line to mainline standards. In 1911, this work was completed, with the tighter curves being loosened and the bridges and stations receiving some much needed maintenance. This is also when the current Toronto station was rebuilt, as the government deemed the previous station inadequate to deal with the expected passenger demands. Blackwell's Park was also moved south to its current location. Once the line reopened, the tram motors were sent back south to Sydney, where they then worked the Cronulla tram line. From 1911 onwards, the line really didn't change too much. Services generally were the normal Fast-Fern to Toronto shuttles, with occasional through services towards Newcastle. In the 1970s, the steam locomotives were replaced with two-car diesels, typically a 627-20 class railcar. In 1984, the line between Gosford and Newcastle was electrified, and the Toronto line was left out. This is often cited as the death blow for the line, as afterwards, Toronto to Newcastle through services were withdrawn altogether, leaving only the Toronto to Fast-Fern shuttle. A short section of the Toronto line platform at Fast-Fern was electrified, where an NC set or V set would typically wait for the train from Toronto, so passengers could connect directly to Newcastle. On the 30th of March 1990, the line closed, and to put it lightly, the locals weren't happy. As you can see on screen, there were a lot of locals who came out to see the final service and show opposition to it being cancelled, and one guy got arrested for trying to fight the train. In the following months, there were demands from the local community for services to resume, but they fell on deaf ears. Since then, the line has been left abandoned, with rail services being replaced by a bus service. So what's the state of the infrastructure today? It's about what you'd expect for a line that's been abandoned for 33 years. Thankfully, the right-of-way is preserved in its entirety. A rail trail was constructed alongside the line in case it was ever to be reopened, and I'd highly recommend doing it if you're ever in the area. The platforms themselves are well preserved. The platform at Fast-Fern visually appears to be in good condition, and more than likely would only need a new coat of paint and some benches in order to be returned to service. Only the platform itself at Blackwell's Park remains, but it appears to be in good condition as well. The platform would need to be resurfaced, and a waiting shelter would need to be added before being returned to service, however. Toronto Station also appears to be in good condition. The station building is currently used by the Lake Macquarie and District Historical Society, so it can be assumed to be in good condition, and the platform also appears to be in good condition as well. More than likely, Toronto Station could be returned to service with only a platform resurfacing and a few fixtures being installed. Thankfully, modern passenger operations don't require large station buildings, so more than likely, the Historical Society wouldn't need to be kicked out either. In terms of trackage, you've probably noticed that it's quite overgrown. The current trackage and right-of-way would need to be cleared and completely rebuilt before any services were to return. New level crossings would need to be installed on Fawcett, Lake, and Carey Street. Additionally, all bridges along the line would need to be replaced. The first on Fast-Fern Road appears to be structurally sound, and more than likely has been maintained in order to not put road traffic at risk. However, I still think replacing it would be a good option before restarting services, as its small size limits road traffic, and it might not be able to take the weight of more modern trains, but if need be, could be returned to service. The next bridges at Coffeepot Creek, Mud Creek, and Stony Creek are all very rusty and do not appear to be in good condition at all. I don't believe they've received any major maintenance since the line closed, so I don't believe they could be safely returned to service, and as such, would need to be replaced. So, assuming we wanted to bring back passenger services, what would be needed? With my previous video on restarting train services to Cessnock, I based my assessment on a minimum viable passenger service. I'm not going to do that here, mainly because the minimum viable service would be what it was in 1990. While that works, it is what killed the line. So I'm going to base my assessment on the next step up from a minimum viable service. So first up, the tracks themselves. The line in 1990 died because it was unelectrified. So I'm proposing we electrify it. I'll base my cost assessment on completely rebuilding the tracks and bridges. The example I'm going to use is the South West Rail Link in Sydney. I'm using it for a few reasons. The main one being that it's one of a few examples of a new electrified railway being built, and it was done fairly recently. The second, I'll talk more about later. For my calculation, I'm going to divide the South West Rail Link's cost into 4 parts. 2 parts for each of the tracks, 1 part for the new stations, and 1 part for the stabling yard. I would break this down more accurately, but I can't find data on how much each part of the project cost, unfortunately. I do need to note, the South West Rail Link construction costs also included a tunnel and some fairly long viaducts, but I'm not going to attempt to exclude these from my cost analysis to reduce the complexity of my maths and a better factor in unknown costs. Anyway, as the Toronto line is only a single track, and I'll be calculating the station costs separately, I'll take the total cost of the South West Rail Link and divide it by 4 to work out the cost to rebuild and electrify the line. The South West Rail Link costs a total of $1.8 billion for 11.4 kilometres of track. Divided by 4 is $450 million, divided by 11.4 to get the cost per kilometre, and that's $39.5 million per kilometre. Since the Toronto line is 4 kilometres long, that gives a total cost to rebuild the line of $158 million. Next up is the stations themselves. I'm going to put them into 2 categories: refurbish and rebuild. The first station is Fassifern. I'll place the Toronto line platforms at Fassifern in the refurbish category. The platform and shelter appear to be in good condition. Additionally, features like toilet blocks and Opal card readers wouldn't need to be installed, since they're already provided. But I'm not going to factor that out of my calculation to account for unforeseen costs. I also don't believe it would be necessary to restore the former loop track unless the long-term goal would be duplication of the line, but I don't believe that is necessary at this time. The next would be Blackwell's Park, which I would also place in the refurbished category. The platform appears to be in good condition along its entire length, so it more than likely would only need to be resurfaced and have the normal station fixtures installed. The final station is Toronto. While it is in good condition, I don't believe it should be reused. My proposal would be instead construct a new station on the western side of Carey Street. This avoids a level crossing on Carey Street, which since 1990 has become a much busier road. This new site is also not far from the centre of Toronto, or the original station's location. The former station forms a hub for the area's bus network. While my proposal would be in a different location, it should still allow for easy transfers between modes. There is also an empty site next to the track, which if need be, could be converted into a bus interchange, but that isn't necessary at the moment. For the new station, my proposal would be for a single platform on the southern side of the line. I would also suggest a stabling track on the northern side, and potentially as a second platform in future. As for how much each station would cost, for stations that need to be refurbished, I'll be basing my costs off of Wallerawang Station, which is a 2-platform station that is set to reopen sometime in 2023 at a cost of $7 million. For rebuilds, I'll be basing the cost on Shell Harbour Junction Station, which cost $39 million for 2 electrified platforms and opened in 2014. As in my previous video, I'm going to divide the costs into thirds. 1/3 for each platform and 1/3 for other fixtures. As a result, I estimate that Fassifern and Blackwell's Park will cost $4.6 million each to refurbish. For Toronto, I'm going to base its costs on 2 platforms for simplicity's sake, giving a total cost of $39 million, for a total cost of $48.2 million to refurbish and rebuild all the stations. The final relevant cost dimension will be the level crossings and signalling. With the project I've proposed here, there'd be 2 crossings total, one on Fawcett Street and one on Lake Street. The best estimate of cost to install the necessary equipment I can get is from an article by the ABC, which estimates the cost to be around $400,000 to $1 million. I'm just going to be safe and use the higher number, so that adds an additional $2 million to the project cost. For signalling, I propose it should be done the same as it was when the line was open, with the line treated as a single block and a signal controlling entry to the line at the Toronto end of Fassifern Station. Since the line is only 4 kilometres long, and trains only took 20 minutes to run from one end of the line to the other, so unless a frequency of more than every 20 minutes is needed, a basic signalling system should do. If more frequent services are needed, the right-of-way is wide enough for 2 lines, so it could be easily duplicated as far as Blackwell's Park, and use a similar signal layout to the Richmond line in Sydney. But this is unlikely to be needed for a very long time. For total project cost, this comes out to $208.2 million, excluding rolling stock. For rolling stock, this is where I mentioned the other reason I base my costs on the South West Rail link. I think the Toronto line should form part of a new Newcastle suburban line. In my opinion, the section of the main northern line that runs through Newcastle shows potential as a heavy rail backbone to a region with poor public transport. Currently, intercity trains are only hourly most of the time, which isn't good enough if you're travelling within Newcastle itself. For the most part, only the Newcastle interchange to Fassifern section would justify more services, as the stations along this section are surrounded by suburbs, while the stations further south are surrounded by bushland. But that presents a problem. As it stands right now, adding more services would require either running trains south to Wyong, where they can terminate, which wouldn't necessarily be viable, or we find a way for them to terminate at Fassifern. So, extending the line to Toronto allows trains to terminate while also expanding passenger services to an underserved area. The astute among you may contend that you couldn't run more passenger trains between Fassifern and Newcastle interchange because the line is heavily used by freight trains. To that, I would agree. The Main North currently forms the main line between Sydney and Brisbane and sees near constant container and coal trains. So if we want to increase passengers to anything less than hourly, we need to reduce the amount of freight trains on that section of line. Well, there are 2 options for that. The first is to run fewer freight trains, which probably isn't great for the economy and would probably anger freight companies. So the other option would be to find a bypass. The good news is that our friends at the New South Wales government have already considered this. Currently, the Lower Hunter Freight Corridor is under consideration, which would create a freight bypass between Fassifern and Hexham. Building this would mean nearly all freight traffic between Fassifern and Hexham wouldn't have to travel through the centre of Newcastle, and it would allow for more passenger services. Assuming this happens, and with the Toronto line taking 20 minutes to traverse, theoretically we could run 3 trains per hour between Toronto and Newcastle, alongside an additional intercity express service only calling at major stops. Not only would this make getting the train around Newcastle more convenient, it would also mean that all stop and limited stop Central Coast and Newcastle line services wouldn't need to serve smaller stations in Newcastle, speeding up journey times for intercity travellers. With that, what rolling stock would I recommend? The funny option would be to bring back the old NC or K sets that used to provide 2-car peak hour services around Newcastle. While it would be funny, it wouldn't necessarily be viable. The more realistic option would be to use either D or H set trains. More than likely, the full Toronto to Newcastle service would only need 2 to 3 trains for 20-minute frequencies, so existing members of the fleet could be used without reducing services elsewhere. With all that, the final question is, would it even be viable? Toronto on its own? No. Toronto only has a population of 6,000 people, which while I agree they have a right to good public transport, it's hard to justify spending $200 million or more to provide them with a train service. However, as part of a regional public transport project, I would say it's viable. If you're travelling along the main North Corridor in Newcastle, almost all journeys can be made at the same speed or faster by rail. Fassifern and Newcastle interchange by train ranges from 27 to 32 minutes, while for driving, it's 28 to 45 minutes. If you do the same for Toronto, assuming our new service is as fast as the previous service, we can estimate a Toronto to Newcastle interchange journey time of 37 to 42 minutes, and 30 to 50 minutes for driving. At hourly frequencies, it's not viable to get the train if it's only going to save you 10 to 15 minutes. But if it's every 20 minutes, then it becomes an appealing option. So if this is done as a Newcastle project, not just a Toronto project, that 200 million doesn't seem to be so bad, especially since Newcastle and Lake Macquarie have a combined population of 390,000 people. Sure, not everyone lives near the corridor, but it runs almost dead centre through the city, and nearly 40,000 people live directly next to the stations. From that alone, I would assess this as viable. The population is there, it would be fast, it would be frequent, and it would provide public transport to areas that desperately need it. In conclusion, let's do it. Newcastle and the Hunter deserve high quality public transport, and it's a shame the New South Wales government has done its part to make it a reality. The Toronto line should never have been closed in the first place, and it more than likely would have survived if it weren't for the fact the government chose not to electrify the branch. But in the modern day, with the climate crisis looming over our heads, and Newcastle lacking public transport, having a heavy rail backbone that is faster than driving would reduce car usage while also making it cheaper and easier to get around the city. I say we do it. If you disagree or have anything to add, please tell me in the comments. I know this isn't a foolproof proposal, and there are going to be things that I've missed. This video is more just to start the discussion about reopening the line and discuss some of the interesting history about the line. As a final note, I want to give a big thanks to two people. The first is my friend Manako, who took photos of a lot of the bridges and infrastructure along the line at my request. The second is Semi-Retired Foamer for allowing me to use the images and photos he had taken back when the line was open. Both of those people, this video would not have been possible without their support.